I never intended to cheat on my husband. That's the truth, no matter how this ends. And if you're looking for drama or some torrid confession soaked in guilt, you might be disappointed. It's not that I feel proud, I don't, but what happened was far more human than wicked. My name is Laura. I'm 54, married for 28 years to a man named Daniel, and until recently, I thought I knew everything about myself. We live just outside of Portland in a grayish-blue house with wisteria vines curling around the porch. We have a Labrador, grown kids who've long flown the nest, and a closet full of holiday decorations sorted by season and color. To the world, we were what you'd call comfortable. But comfort can be its own kind of emptiness. And over the years, Daniel and I had quietly shifted from lovers to housemates, bound not by passion, but routine. We still had dinners together, still discussed the news over coffee, but the sparkle was long gone. And I didn't think much of it. I suppose I told myself this was just what marriage looked like after a few decades. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. I was sitting in a cafe downtown, the kind of place with crooked tables and chalkboard menus that list obscure pastries and herbal teas no one can pronounce. I had just come from a dentist appointment, one of those irritating midday ones that split your day in half, and I decided to treat myself to a cappuccino. Nothing unusual. The cafe was half empty, filled mostly with college students and two men in suits arguing over a spreadsheet. I was flipping through a novel I'd been meaning to finish when he walked in. He wasn't young, maybe in his late 50s, but he had that kind of careless charm some men carry like an old leather jacket. His hair was salt and pepper, not shaved down like Daniel's, but thick and slightly disheveled. He had laugh lines, a small scar near his lip, and eyes the color of wet slate. He ordered black coffee, no nonsense, and when he turned to scan the room, our eyes met and lingered. I smiled, reflexively polite, and then turned back to my book. But he didn't look away right away. I felt it. That pause. That notice. It's hard to describe unless you've felt it yourself. When someone looks at you not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a woman your age, but as a woman. A few minutes later, he sat down across from me. Mind if I join you? Place is packed, he said, even though it clearly wasn't. I laughed. It's practically deserted. That's the polite way of saying you'd rather sit alone. I looked up from my book, amused. I didn't say that. He introduced himself. His name was Mark, with a C he emphasized later, as though that made him more European, more artistic somehow. He was a freelance architectural photographer in town for a gallery show. I thought it was a line, until he pulled out a small portfolio and slid it across the table. His photos were stark and beautiful. Abandoned factories, collapsing theaters, the play of shadow and glass in a modern atrium. We talked about light, about decay, about things that once were glorious and were now forgotten. I said something about how buildings were like people, they wore time on their surfaces. He looked at me for a long second and said, "Some people wear it beautifully." I remember laughing, blushing. I hadn't felt noticed like that in years. What struck me wasn't just how he looked or what he said, it was the attention. Focused, quiet, male attention. It came without effort, and I soaked it up like a dry sponge. We talked for nearly 2 hours. When I finally glanced at my watch and realized how late it had gotten, I stood quickly. I should go. My husband's expecting me. I regretted it the moment I said it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. I wanted to linger longer in that stolen afternoon. He nodded with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope I see you again," he said. "Laura." He remembered my name. For the next few days, I floated. That sounds absurd, but it's the only word that fits. I went through my routines, feeding the dog, folding laundry, listening to Daniel explain his new cholesterol meds, but something had shifted. I kept seeing Mark's eyes in my mind. The way he listened, the curve of his mouth when he smiled. It wasn't until a week later that I saw him again. I walked into the same cafe almost without thinking, and there he was in the corner, laptop open. He looked up as if he'd been waiting, smiled, gently, and gestured to the seat across from him. "You again," I said, feigning surprise. "Or you." We picked up the conversation as if no time had passed. But there was a new undercurrent now, something electric. Our hands brushed as we passed sugar packets. Our knees touched briefly under the table and didn't move away. I remember the way his voice dropped when he spoke close, the timbre deep and textured, like old wood. This time, when I stood to leave, he didn't pretend not to ask. "Can I see you again? Somewhere less caffeinated?" My heart jumped. I should have said no. Every part of me knew that. But I heard myself say, maybe. Over the next few weeks, we met often. It started innocently enough, walks downtown, gallery visits, long talks in that cafe. But there was nothing innocent about the way he looked at me, or the way I responded. The first time he touched me wasn't dramatic. We were standing close, looking at an installation piece made of broken mirrors, and he rested a hand lightly on my lower back. Just a touch. But it was the kind that wakes up every nerve in your body. "I think about you more than I should," he murmured. And I let him kiss me. His lips were softer than I expected. His hands firm. The kiss was slow, exploratory, tasting. I clutched his jacket like a girl and kissed him back until I couldn't breathe. That night, I lay awake next to Daniel, staring at the ceiling fan. My body still hummed from the kiss. My guilt fought with my exhilaration, but it was a distant murmur, not a siren. I felt alive. More alive than I had in years. It wasn't until the following week that it happened. That everything happened. Mark rented a studio downtown for a photo shoot and invited me to see it. I told Daniel I was meeting an old friend for lunch. I wore my navy wrap dress, the one that clung in all the right places, and a shade of lipstick I hadn't touched in years. The studio was flooded with light. There were canvases leaning against the walls, a mattress draped in white linen, a table with scattered Polaroids. When I walked in, he kissed me before the door, even closed. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," he whispered against my neck. And I didn't stop him. His hands moved with reverence and hunger. He peeled away my dress like it was a ribbon, kissing every inch of newly exposed skin. My breath came in gasps. I felt stripped, not just of clothing, but of years of numbness. He made love to me there, on the makeshift bed in that sun-drenched room, with the kind of slow, indulgent attention I didn't know I was starving for. And I responded with a wildness I didn't recognize in myself. Afterward, we lay tangled together, our bodies slick with sweat and sun. He traced lazy circles on my hip. I told him things I hadn't told anyone. He listened like each word was sacred. I didn't think about the consequences then. I only knew that something inside me had been reawakened. Something raw and real. And I wasn't ready to let it go. The days that followed blurred into a surreal blend of routine and secret longing. I'd wake up beside Daniel, his back turned toward me, breathing soft and steady, and wonder how I'd gone so long pretending this was enough. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't neglectful. In fact, he still brought me tea some mornings. But the intimacy, the slow-burning fire, had been extinguished by the quiet erosion of familiarity. With Mark, every glance, every message, every moment stolen felt like oxygen. He began texting me short things, never over the top, never vulgar. Just intimate. "Still can't forget how you sounded Saturday. You left your earring. I'm not giving it back unless you make me. I save them. Read them at night in bed with my phone tilted just enough so the screen wouldn't glow too bright. I even caught myself reapplying lipstick before going to the grocery store, imagining, fantasizing, that I'd bump into him near the produce aisle. His fingers brushing against mine over a red apple. We met once the following week. A hotel this time. Midday. Neutral. No art on the walls. No lingering perfume from past guests. Just us, the anonymity of a clean room, and an hour we both devoured like starving people. He undressed me slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing the map of my body. There was nothing rushed, nothing sloppy. He whispered compliments into my neck, his hands mapping every curve, every softness, like they mattered. And God, it mattered to me. "You have no idea," he murmured, hips pressed against mine, "how long I've wanted to do this again." I lost count of how many times I came. How many times I made him say my name. But it wasn't just the sex. It was how I felt afterward. Radiant. Like someone had cracked me open and poured something warm and golden into the hollow spaces I didn't know were empty. Of course, I tried to rationalize it. We weren't hurting anyone, not really. Daniel and I hadn't touched each other in months. Years, maybe. And when we did, it was mechanical, cautious. Like we were following a recipe from a page we no longer understood. But that quiet voice, the one that used to scream in Sunday school, the one my mother planted deep in me, whispered, "You're betraying a good man." I ignored her. Instead, I bought new lingerie. Black lace. Something decadent. I shaved places I hadn't bothered with since our anniversary trip to the Oregon coast back in 2011. I started moisturizing more, wearing perfume again. Subtle things. Things Daniel probably noticed, but didn't know how to interpret. He did ask once, half a joke, half curiosity, "You seeing someone behind my back?" I laughed. "Wouldn't you like to know?" I teased, pressing a kiss to his cheek. He smiled, shook his head, and went back to his paper. And just like that, I knew I could get away with it. Mark, meanwhile, was a puzzle I couldn't stop solving. He didn't offer much about his past: divorced, 2 grown daughters in New York, a cottage he was fixing up somewhere along the coast. He never tried to overstep or claim more than I could give. And I think that's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't demanding. He just was there. Like a door I kept opening. We began seeing each other once a week. Always during the day. Always brief. Always enough to leave me aching when it ended. And I started lying better. With less guilt. My stomach stopped nodding when I said I was meeting friends. I kept a small bag in my car with lingerie, perfume, and breath mints. I deleted texts after reading them. I cleared my browser history. It was intoxicating how easy it became. But it wasn't just sex, it wasn't even mostly that. One afternoon, I told him about my father's slow, humiliating descent into dementia. About watching a strong man turn into a stranger, forgetting my name, mistaking me for his sister. Mark just listened. He didn't offer cliches or pity. He sat beside me, took my hand, and kissed my knuckles like he was sealing a promise. No one had touched me like that in a decade. The emotional intimacy was more dangerous than the physical. We shared favorite poems, discussed movies that made us cry. I told him about the miscarriage I had in 1998 and never mentioned again. He told me about a woman he almost married in his 30s, but didn't, because she wanted children and he wasn't ready. He regretted it. One afternoon, in the studio again, he photographed me. Not posed or styled, just as I was. Shirt half open, no makeup, hair wild from his fingers. "You're beautiful," he said as he adjusted the lens. "You're biased," I replied. "I'm an artist," he said. "I notice what others miss." And I believed him. But the thing about living 2 lives is that eventually, the seams start to tear. It happens slowly. Daniel asked more questions. Not suspicious, exactly. Just attentive in a way he hadn't been in years. "You're dressing differently," he said one Sunday as I buttoned up a silk blouse I hadn't worn in years. I smiled in the mirror. I just felt like looking nice. "For who?" he asked, half laughing. I leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "For me." But the lie sat between us like an uninvited guest. The turning point came one rainy Tuesday when Mark didn't text back. No message. No call. Silence. I told myself he was busy. But by the evening, my fingers were trembling. When he finally did text the next morning, it was short. "Sorry. Family thing. Everything okay?" I hated how relieved I was. Hated how angry I was too. Because that's when I realized I needed him. Not just wanted, needed. Like air. Like something that had grafted onto my sense of self. And that terrified me. Daniel made reservations for our anniversary that week. 29 years. He chose a French place with soft lighting and expensive wine. We dressed up. He wore a tie. I wore heels. He held my hand across the table, looked into my eyes, and said, "You've been distant lately." I froze. I didn't want to say anything, he continued. But I notice. I looked down at my wine glass. I've just been in my own head. He nodded, but I saw the doubt behind his eyes. The sadness. I still love you, Laura, he said quietly. I almost cried. Not because I didn't love him too, but because I didn't know how to anymore. Not in the way he meant. That night, I didn't meet Mark. I went home with Daniel. We made love.
Gently.
Hesitantly, like people trying to find their way back through the fog. He whispered my name, told me I was beautiful, and I lay there, letting him believe it was enough. But it wasn't. I couldn't unknow what it felt like to be wanted. Not appreciated. Not tolerated.
Desired.
And once you've tasted that again at 54, it becomes a hunger you can't unfeel. In the weeks after our anniversary dinner, something in me began to fray. I felt like I was living between two panes of glass, pressed between a life I'd built and a life I'd discovered, unable to fully belong to either. Everything became sharper. The way Daniel chewed with too much noise. The way Mark never called, only texted. The silence in my kitchen at night. The thrill when I'd see Mark's name light up on my phone. I was straddling two selves. The woman I had been for decades, and the woman I had become in secret. Mark noticed the change before I said anything. You're quieter, he said one afternoon as we lay together on the creaky leather sofa in his studio. I was draped across his chest, my leg curled around his, still warm from the aftermath. Am I? He played with the strand of my hair. You always drift a little after, but today you feel somewhere else.
I didn't respond.
He shifted under me. You okay? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to wrap myself in that stolen warmth and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But it did. And the harder I tried to keep it all together, the more it started to crumble around the edges. I think Daniel knows, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't flinch. He simply nodded once.
Slowly.
What makes you think that? I stared at a spot on the wall where the sunlight touched the edge of a dusty frame. He's watching me again, like he used to. And it's not because he wants to, it's because he's afraid of what he'll find. Mark exhaled deeply. Do you want to tell him? The question hung in the air like fog. I sat up, pulling the thin sheet around my shoulders, suddenly feeling very exposed. Do you want me to? He met my eyes without hesitation. That's not my place. Yes, it is, I said quietly. Whether you like it or not, you're not just an escape anymore. That was the truth, though I hadn't said it aloud before. What began as a thrill had evolved into something denser, more tangled. He had become a part of my world, whether or not I'd given him permission. Mark rubbed his hands over his face. The first time, he looked genuinely tired in my presence. If you told him, what would you want to happen? I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know what I wanted. A few days later, Daniel came home early from a golf game. I was in the kitchen, putting away groceries, the house unusually quiet. He walked in, set his keys down, and stood there for a moment, watching me. Finally, he said, "Is there someone else?" I froze, turned, stared at him. I don't want a story, he continued, his voice gentle, not accusatory. I just want to know if I'm imagining it. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear myself speak. Yes, I said, because lying felt like more betrayal than the truth. He sat at the kitchen table, quiet,
Composed.
He ran his hand over the smooth wood surface like it helped him stay grounded. How long? He asked. 3 months. He nodded, looked down. Then, do you love him? I don't know. It was the only honest answer I had. Daniel didn't yell,
Didn't throw anything.
Instead, he sat there in silence, and that silence was far worse than any screaming match I had imagined. I always thought we were fine, he said eventually. Boring, maybe. Predictable. But fine. I thought we were too, I said. He looked up. Then what changed? I opened my mouth, closed it again. How do you explain the slow erosion of passion? The years of putting yourself last, of shrinking to fit the expectations of a family, a marriage, a routine? How do you tell someone that you didn't even know you were disappearing until someone looked at you like you mattered? I did. I said finally. I changed.
Daniel didn't speak.
He simply stood, walked over to the sink, and poured himself a glass of water. His hands trembled slightly.
I wish you had told me, he said.
I didn't know how, I said. I still don't. And with that, he walked upstairs, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt enormous. Mark and I met the next afternoon in his studio. I told him everything, word for word. His reaction was measured, but behind his calm I sensed something uneasy. I think part of him never expected me to confess, to actually say it to my husband. "So what now?" he asked. I didn't have a map. There was no script for this. "I don't know," I admitted. "Daniel didn't ask me to leave. He didn't say he wanted a divorce. But things aren't the same now. They can't be." Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that shook me more than I expected. "Do you still want this?"
Us.
I stared at him, caught off guard. "Of course I do. Because this only works in the dark," he said. "Now that light's coming in, it's going to change things." I realized then, he was afraid too. I spent the following week trying to navigate the strange limbo that follows a broken truth. Daniel and I became polite, distant but not cold. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer information. We shared the same bed, but it might as well have been a boarder. I cooked. He did the dishes. We talked about mundane things, trash pickup, the neighbor's tree trimming, the tax bill. And in all of it, I saw a man trying to hold himself together. I wondered if that was love or habit, if we were trying to rebuild something, or just avoid letting it fall. Mark, meanwhile, had pulled back. Not obviously. He still texted, still met me when I asked, still touched me like I was made of something sacred. But there was hesitation now, a slight dimming. And though he never said the words, I felt it in the space between our bodies when we lay together. He was waiting for me to choose. But how do you choose between two parts of yourself? One night, I walked into the bathroom after brushing my teeth and saw myself in the mirror. Really saw myself. The silver in my hair. The softness in my belly. The fine lines etched around my mouth and eyes. I wasn't the young woman Daniel had married. I wasn't the muse Mark saw through his lens. I was something else entirely. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of her. I stood there in my robe, the light buzzing softly overhead, and whispered to my reflection, "What do you want?" Not what does Daniel deserve? Not what does Mark offer? What do you want? And the answer came, not in a voice, but in a pulse. I wanted more. Not from Mark. Not from Daniel. From myself. The next time I saw Mark, I didn't undress. I didn't kiss him. I didn't reach for the buttons on his shirt like a script. Instead, I sat beside him and said, "I need time." He blinked, stunned. Time? I don't want to go back to pretending nothing happened. But I can't keep living in half-truths either. He looked at me, long and quiet, then nodded. "I care about you, Laura. But I don't want to be the reason you're torn in two." "I'm already torn," I said softly. "That's not your fault." He kissed my forehead before I left. Just once. Tender. Final. Back at home, Daniel was sitting on the back porch, a blanket draped over his legs, sipping whiskey from a chipped glass. The sky was turning lavender, dusk creeping in. He looked at me, and this time he didn't look away. "You're not the same," he said. "No," I said. "I'm not." He nodded. And then he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Maybe I'm not either." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was possibility. The days grew cooler. Autumn crept in slowly, spilling gold onto the sidewalks and thinning the trees in our neighborhood one leaf at a time. It matched my mood, a soft descent into something quieter, more contemplative. Mark and I didn't speak for 3 weeks. Not because I asked him not to, not because he wanted distance, but because the space between us had become sacred in its own way. A pause. A breath. A necessary step back from a connection that had become too much, too fast. Daniel and I, on the other hand, began talking not about the affair, not about what had passed between us, but about the life we had lived together. We talked about our son, and the time he got lost at the county fair. About our first house with the crooked steps. About the Thanksgiving when the turkey caught fire, and we had Chinese takeout instead. We didn't talk about love. We talked about memory. And maybe that was its own kind of love. One night, sitting beside each other on the couch, not touching but not apart either, Daniel said, "I miss what we used to be. But I think maybe we both outgrew it and didn't notice." I didn't cry. I thought I would. But instead, I reached over, put my hand over his, and said, "So what do we do now?" He looked at our hands, then at me. We stopped pretending. He moved into the guest room the next day. It wasn't dramatic.
No boxes. No slam doors.
Just a quiet transition into a new rhythm. We were still kind, still cooperative. But something had shifted. There was an honesty in the air now, fragile but unmistakable. I started sleeping better. About a month later, I texted Mark. "Coffee." His reply came 5 minutes later. "Always." We met at a small cafe on the edge of the city, one we hadn't visited before, somewhere anonymous. I wore no makeup, just a soft navy sweater and jeans. He looked the same, but older somehow, like time had brushed over him in the weeks we were apart. We didn't hug. We just sat down across from each other, and for a while, we didn't speak. Finally, I said, "I didn't come here to pick things back up. I came to tell you something." His eyes held mine. "Okay." I took a breath. "I loved how you made me feel. I still think about it. But I realized that what I was chasing with you wasn't you, exactly. It was the part of myself I'd lost a long time ago." He nodded slowly.
No anger. No hate.
"Just understanding. You helped me find her," I said. "That version of me I thought had disappeared under all the years and dishes and obligations. You woke her up." "I think she was always there," he said. "Maybe she just needed a witness." I smiled. "Maybe." We sat in silence a while longer. The world moved around us. Cups clinked, chairs scraped. Laughter rose and fell from another table. "You're still one of the most captivating women I've ever known," he said eventually. I looked at him, that face that once made my stomach flip, and felt calm. Not fire. Not urgency. Just warmth. "Thank you," I said, "for everything. But I think I need to know who I am without anyone holding me up." He smiled softly. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard you say." After that, I began reconstructing my life, not around Daniel, not around Mark, but around myself. I started walking every morning, not for exercise, but because it felt good. I joined a book club at the library, something I always meant to do, but never prioritized. I took a solo weekend trip to a quiet town on the coast and stayed in a bed and breakfast where I read an entire novel in 2 days and drank wine while wrapped in a blanket watching the waves roll in. Daniel and I eventually sat down at the kitchen table and had the talk I'd been avoiding. "I don't think I want to be married anymore," I said. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know. I care about you," I added. "You'll always be family. But we're not partners anymore." He looked down at his hands, then up at me. "Maybe we haven't been for a long time." It wasn't easy. We cried. We laughed. We held hands. We signed papers. We told our son, who took it better than we feared. He said he'd seen it coming. And when it was all over, when the last signature dried, I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. A year later, I ran into Mark again, at an art opening of all places. He had a new camera, a new jacket, a new line of photos featuring, ironically, hands. Black and white, stark, expressive. "Yours were the first," he told me when we stood side by side looking at a large print of a woman's hand gripping the corner of a bedsheet. I smiled.
"I'm honored."
He looked at me, long and slow. "You're still stunning." I laughed. "Flattery doesn't work on me anymore." "Shame," he said with a grin. We shared a glass of wine. Talked about nothing. We didn't make plans. We didn't promise anything. And that was perfect. Now I live in a smaller house with big windows. I fill it with flowers. I dance to old records while cooking dinner. I sleep diagonally across the bed. I write in a journal every morning with coffee and the radio low in the background. Sometimes I date. Sometimes I don't. I flirt when I feel like it. I walk away when I don't. But I am not ashamed. I had an affair. And yes, it was messy, complicated,
Bittersweet.
but it woke me up. And now, I'm living wide awake.